All right, cool. All right, we got that recorded too. Y'all ready? All right. It's 2:20 in the morning. It's January 23rd, 2022. It's going to be part one. I don't know how far this series is going to go, but I'm going to go straight into it. You can rewind it, but we got to tape it in multiple locations. Part one, this is a light intro. So again, a light intro into the origins of the so-called Tower of Babel Blocks of the Lost Generation, the Greatest Generation, the Silent Generation, Baby Boomers, Generation X, Millennials, Generation Z, and Generation Alpha. So I'll say it again. Part one, a light intro into the origins of the so-called Tower of Babel Blocks of the Lost Generation, Greatest Generation, the Silent Generation, Baby Boomers, Generation X, Millennials, Generation Z, and Generation Alpha. So we are in a cosmic case study, and I'll start with only one definition. So I will only do one definition with this. The definition I'm going to go with is cohort. So cohort, a group of people banded together or treated as a group. I'll say it again. A group of people banded together or treated as a group. We are going to go over a light intro to just about 8 cohorts. And we're going to go straight into it. So, cohort number 1. We're going to go with the Lost Generation. Now, the Lost Generation were birthed between 1883 and 1900. So here we go. The Lost Generation was the social generational cohort that was in the early adulthood years during World War I. So they were teachers, lawyers, working towards their dreams during World War I. Now, lost in the context of disoriented, wandering, directionless spirit of many of the war survivors in the early post-war period. So before the war, they were teachers, lawyers, working towards their dreams, hopes and dreams. Post-war, they were disoriented, wandering, directionless. Okay. Now, this term is also particularly used to refer to a group of American writers who created it, who were living in Paris during the 1920s. I say they escaped American war condition to Paris in the 1920s. So Gertrude Stein is credited with coining the term, and it was popularized by Ernest Hemingway, who used it in the epigraph for the 1926 novel The Sun Also Rises. You all are a lost generation. Now, trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. In a more general sense, the lost generation is considered to be made up of individuals born between 1883 and 1900. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, Western members of the Lost Generation grew up in societies which were more literate, consumerist, and media saturated than ever before. Now again, media grew, but you see what the Lost Generation was going through. They were more literate, but they were consumerist, and it was media saturated than ever before. Now, which also tended to maintain strictly conservative social values. So again, more literate, consumerist, media saturated than ever before, but also tended to maintain strictly conservative social values. Young men of the cohort were mobilized on a mass scale for the First World War, a conflict which often seen as a defining moment of age. Seen as a defining moment of their age group's lifespan. Now, check this dividing moment out. Young women also contributed and were affected by the war and its aftermath, gained greater freedoms politically and in other areas. Now, the lost generation was also heavily vulnerable to the Spanish flu pandemic. So we talking about the early 1900s, and they experienced the Spanish flu pandemic and became the driving force behind many cultural changes, particularly known as, in major cities, as known as the Roaring Twenties. Now they say it's nothing new under the sun. So during the Roaring Twenties, they were going through a Spanish flu pandemic during the Roaring Twenties. Now check this out. Later, they experienced the economic effects of the Great Depression and often saw their sons leave for battlefields of the Second World War. In the developed world, they tend to reach retirement at an average life expectancy during the decades after the conflict, but some significantly outlived the norm. Now, the last surviving person, who was also known to have been born during the 19th century, they died in 2018. Now, I'm talking about the lost generation who was born from 1883 to 1900, and I haven't even talked about my culture yet, or I'll say our culture, but I said our because the word our makes the listeners ask more questions versus giving the title of our, which puts the listeners in an instant so-called teacher mode. So I'm talking about the different generational so-called Tower of Babel blocks of the different generations. And we're going to get to your generation too. But again, this is part one and a light intro. Cohort number 2, the greatest generation. Now, the greatest generation was born between 1901 to 1924. Now, the greatest generation, also known as the GI generation and the World War II generation, is the demographic cohort following the lost generation and preceding the silent generation. Now, this generation is generally defined as people born from 1901 to 1924. Now, watch this. Look where we come from. They were shaped by the Great Depression and were the primary participants in World War II. The term "the greatest generation" was popularized by the title of the 1998 book by the American journalist Tom Brokaw. In the book, Brokaw profiled American members of this generation who came of age during the Great Depression and went on to fight in World War II, as well as those who contributed to the war effort on the home front. Now, Brokaw wrote that these men and women, watch this, they fought not for the fame or recognition. They fought because it was the right thing to do. That sounds great. Now, again, we talking about people born from like 1901 and 1924 outside of your culture, and I'm going to show you how that trickles over to your culture. In the United States, members of this generation came of age where children or were born during the Progressive Era, World War I, and the Roaring Twenties, a time of economic prosperity with distinctive cultural transformations. Additionally, those alive in 1918 through 1920, again, like I said earlier, experienced the deadly Spanish flu pandemic. So there were people that went through pandemics. I'm not saying this pandemic is not affecting a lot of people, but there were humans who came before us who experienced pandemics. Let's see how they got out of it. Now, this is 1901 and 1924. Now, they experienced much of their youth with rapid technological innovation, radio, telephone, automobile, amidst growing levels of worldwide income inequality and a soaring economy. Now, after the stock market crashed, this generation experienced profound economic and social turmoil. So boom, y'all get to see in society how everybody gets to everybody gets to experience the roller coaster. Oh my God, it's on. We get in the bag. It's only up from here. Just look at history. So, here's some bars though. Here's some bars. Because again, we talking about 1901 to 1924, the greatest generation, cohort number 2. Check this out. Despite the hardships, historians note that literature, arts, music, and cinema productions of that period flourished. So they're talking about what was job security back then. Sounds like about now. Despite the hardships, historians, this is not my opinion, historians note that literature, arts, music, and cinema productions of the period flourished. So again, here's job security. This generation experienced what commonly referred to as the golden age of Hollywood. A number of popular film genres, including gangster films, musicals, comedies, and monster films, attracted mass audience. Think about it. It was a pandemic. People were sitting down watching stuff, being programmed. The Great Depression also greatly influenced literature and witnessed the advent of comic books. There was no social media. Yeah, I'm going to read this comic book for hours. Yeah, I'm going to sit for hours during the pandemic, which were popular with members of this generation, with such characters as Doc Savage, The Shadow, Superman, Batman. Hold on, time out. These people got so creative to where you might not know who Doc Savage is. You might not know who The Shadow is, but I'll bet you know who Superman and Batman is. So these people had nothing to do during this Spanish flu pandemic and pulled Batman and Superman out their mind. Hold on, they were still creating. Next to jazz, blues, gospel music, and folk music, swing jazz became immensely popular with members of this generation. The term swing jazz, or the swing generation, has also been used to describe the cohort due to the popularity. So following the war, this generation produced children at an unprecedented level. Cohort number 3, the silent generation, the parents of the boomers. 1925 to 1945, the silent generation. So here we go. The silent generation is a demographic cohort following the greatest generation and preceding the baby boomers. The silent generation is generally defined as people born from 1925 to 1945. By this definition and the U.S. Census data, there were about 23 million silents. They call them silents in the United States as of 2019. So I'll say it again. By this definition in the U.S. Census data, there were 23 million silents in the United States as of 2019. Now, in the United States, the generation was comparatively small because the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II in the early to mid 1940s caused people to have fewer children. So that would make sense. But again, who was having children during the Great Depression? Because people were still having children. Remember, these are different cultures. But I promise you, we're going to see where all this depression is coming from. How it's being passed down or being built upon, however you want to take it. Now, I'm going to go to a silent, check this out. Now, this changed my life too. A silent generational father was explaining how he regrets how he raised his baby boomer children. And I was like, it is so weird because this was so bad. This is the silent generation father that had major paper being interviewed how he regrets raising his baby boomer children. So, beginning quote, during the Great Depression, everyone was essentially poor for about 10 years. It started with the stock market crash and got worse after that. When you are poor for a really long time, it makes you a different human being than you were in middle class or rich. They say money don't make you happy. Well, poverty doesn't either. I ran away from home at 16 and bummed around the country for 2 weeks. I faced severe hunger. I only had $7. Now again, let me tell you how old this is. I only had $7, which lasted me 7 days. After that, no money. And that converts to no food. I also didn't know where a soup kitchen was because I didn't know where I was. So I didn't know where other things were either. I quickly turned into a beggar. You may not believe you will do these things, but when you are starving, you change. Now again, this is a Caucasian man. He said Mexicans were the only ones that treated me nice. He said it with dignity too. He said my fellow Anglo-Saxons treated me horribly. He said it with confidence. He said he was at a state of his life where he loved finding garbage because he knew there would be food in there. So again, that's how low he was. He said it made him want to raise his children differently. He wanted to give them bank accounts and he gave them comforts to protect them from these horrors. Then he said after World War II in the 1950s, he said the divorce explosion began. And I was like, man, that was a huge term. He was talking about providing for your children and you talking about divorce. So I was just listening, in my research, and he said, our society is good at training people. We train people to clean teeth. We train them to paint fences, fix automobiles, do brain surgery. But there's no training of the two most important roles humans play. Marriage partner training, 1, and parent partner training, 2. He said they just have you wed and profit off the marriages and the divorces. He said there were absolutely no training or examples to be a better husband or a father for us. He said I was finally able to piece myself together better with my 4th son because I don't think I was a good father to my first 3 boys, even though I love them dearly. Before this, all I thought a father was supposed to do was tell them you love them occasionally and give them a pat on the head occasionally, and that was everything to do. He said, boy, I was wrong. You have to spend a considerable amount of time with them. He said, you will notice through study that sons and daughters of public figures have a decided disadvantage, whether it's the president, senator, rock star, whatever. The reason is very simple. Daddy is on the road a lot and he's out campaigning for office or doing a concert or what have you may. And then he looks around and says, Junior's on dope. I wonder if me not seeing him from 2 to 14 years old had something to do with it. You bet it did. End quote. So that whole story was outside of my culture, but I could see my culture inside of that story. So we're still on the silent generation. We're not even, these people are dead, and I'm just telling you what we're so-called alive and doing stuff that, okay. So according to George Leonard, former senior editor of Look magazine, said many returning World War II veterans came home and just started having children with little to no advice of what they were doing. Even though Dr. Spock had a book out, we didn't know anything about child rearing. That's what, according to him, no one knew. It was just what everyone was doing at the time, according to George Leonard. Now, according to Andrew Sherlin, author of Marriage, Divorce, Remarriage, states that the silent generation experienced tough times as children and as teenagers. They grew up in the Depression, and then World War II hit when they were reaching adulthood. They then had the trauma of the war. Then after that, the 1950s, when the U.S. economy was tremendously prosperous and booming like America had never seen before, the silent generation reacted to these changes by turning inward, by marrying young, by emphasizing home and family more. They couldn't get in the 1930s. They couldn't get that in the 1940s. So they seemed to value it more. So, according to Doug McAdam, sociology department head of the University of Arizona, stated that it was a perfect setting for youth culture. Life in the suburbs were organized around the children. They were the center of attention, with endless rounds of PTA meetings, little league games, etc. The message of the uniqueness and importance of these children were delivered with real force. They made sure they delivered that message. Why, Jason? Well, according to Theodore Wozak, professor of history of Cal State University, said that it was distinctively a new way to be raised. He said distinctively, this was a new way to be raised in the world. It allowed the term spoiled kids to be created. Which also translated to kids with very, very, very high expectations of life, and freedom and happiness was on the top of their list. They carried these views into high school and college. They had the kind of level of expectation, and again, this is outside of our culture, so watch this. They had the kind of level of expectation that was simply unprecedented in world history. The definition, because again, I don't know what unprecedented means, Jason. The definition of unprecedented is never done or known before. So they were basically creating new humans called baby boomers. I was just like, no, I'm not. They created little Frankenstein baby boomers. Okay. This image of giving your children everything you had, they had to be satisfied. They had to be content. I think we gave them too much, according to many silent generational parents. A silent generation interview with a man who was married with 5 children by one woman. His name was Andrew and Jane Takas. They stated that they found out that in the 1950s, if you got up in the morning and went to work, things eventually got progressively better. You got promoted, you made more money, you could buy more furniture, you could have more children, and the children's lives got better. You know, they got better clothing, life just improved, right? Well, we knew it because we went to work. He said, I'm not sure our children realized that. They saw simply that the house got bigger and better. Their clothes got better. Their neighborhood got nicer. He said, I have a suspicion that the children who rebelled in the 1960s took for granted that life would improve It would just approve automatically. He said, here was another guy. My dad always was above board in business. Now tell me this ain't 2022. He said, my dad was always above board in business. He didn't say it like that. I'm just saying it like that. He said, I would always say making money and getting ahead was all my father focused on. I think what it did was dad means well, but dad loves us, but dad is just busy at work. He said his dad will work to 2 a.m. or 2:30 a.m. doing work for his business, and then he would get up early, be gone, and he said I hardly ever saw him. I said that's only 2022. Work schedules. Okay. We're repeating. So we're repeating. That's like having the same cell phone as your great-great-grandpa and stuff like that. You would kind of be, we're repeating this depressive energy. According to Thomas Fleming, author of the book Politics of Human Nature, stated that there is no chance for risk. There was no place for excitement. There was no challenges being offered whatsoever. The only TV shows you could watch were Westerns, which showed what a real man could do. These were shows that allowed men to measure themselves against other men with a gun. I think that anyone who was a red-blooded American boy in the 1950s wanted to be like Matt Dillon or the paid gun actor than Beaver Cleaver's father. Now, this story goes for all cultures living at that time. If you have the ability to think inside of context, so just go to your culture, whatever your culture is, and say, I don't know who Matt Dillon is and Beaver Cleaver, even though I know that was Leave It to Beaver's father. I know what that was. Put it in your culture and make sense of it. They were basically saying everybody wanted to be like the paid gun actor, then a so-called good old wholesome Cliff Huxtable at that time. We're still on the silent generation. Then we're going to the baby boomers after this. So last part. Many people who grew up during that time believe the media began marketing to girls too. Guess what they was marketing to girls? Guess what they was marketing to girls? At that time, they were marketing to girls a life just like their mothers, which influenced them to go the opposite direction. In comes cohort number 4, the baby boomers. Baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. Often shortened as boomers, or the demographic cohort following the silent generation and preceding the Generation X. This generation is generally defined as people born from 1946 to 1964 during post-World War II baby boom. The baby boom has been described variously as a shockwave or the pig in the python. The pig in the python. Like, most baby boomers are children of either the greatest generation or the silent generation. So again, these are the children of the greatest generation and the silent generation. And I gave you a light history of those two generations. So y'all can see how we've been passing depression and depressive energies down. Okay, baby boomers. In the West, boomers' childhoods in the 1950s and 60s had a significant reforms in education, both as a part of the ideological confrontation that was the Cold War, and as a continuation of the inner war period. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, as this relatively large number of young people entered their teens and young adulthood, The oldest turned 18 in 1964. They or those around them created a specific rhetoric around their cohort. Now check this out. Don't get lost. But they created a specific rhetoric around their cohort, and the social movements brought about their size and numbers, such as the counterculture of the 1960s and the backlash. Now, this didn't just happen in America. In many countries, this period was one of the deep political instability due to post-war youth bulge. So even in China, boomers lived through the cultural revolution and were subject, remember this? I know y'all remember this, and were subject to the one-child policy as adults. Remember the one-child policy? You could only have one. Just check it out. These social changes in rhetoric had an important impact on the perceptions of the boomers, and as well as society's increasingly common tendency to define the world in terms of generations. Right? These are generational boxes, which was a relatively new phenomenon. This was considered a new phenomenon. In Europe and North America, many boomers came of age in a time of increasingly affluence and widespread government subsidies in post-war housing and education, and grew up genuinely expecting the world to improve with time. So again, boomers grew up like, the world gonna get better. The world gonna get better. We expect it. We're not hoping, we expect that. We will be shocked. I'm not saying boomers have a hard time with accountability. I never said that. Don't y'all put these words in my mouth. I might have said that. I didn't say all boomers. That's how you protect yourself. But yeah, it seemed like they had a lot of help. So in the early 21st century, baby boomers in developed countries with a few expectations are the single biggest cohort in their societies. Now, here's a baby boomer woman talking about her work experiences. And her name is Cindy French. She's a flight attendant. Remember her job. She's a flight attendant. And president of Council 9 AFA. She said, I had 4 choices growing up. I could be a teacher, I could be a nurse, a stewardess, or a secretary. I couldn't go into medicine or law. I couldn't go into the real professions. It was extremely limiting. And the overall goal was to find a husband, get married, and find children, and live the white picket fence life. Now again, we still with the baby boomers. 1/3 of the baby boomers are a part of the 60s generation. So 1/3. The majority of booms that lived in the 50s grew up in the so-called normal environments. So boomers fit in like 2 generations. The boomers after World War II, between 1946 and 1954, are the early boomers, and in 1954 to 1964. So 1954 to 1964 are the second generation of boomers, and the first generation could be considered more serious, not major drug users, working people with exploring values, but not that much exploring, very conservative. Now the second generation of boomers try more drugs, partying, and much more fun. So many surveys also showed that many of them hated their parents and used to shout, "Don't trust anyone over 30 years old." Okay, we're almost there. We got cohort number 5. We're going to get to Generation Alpha, and then we're good with part 1. So cohort number 5, Generation X. Generation X, 1965 to 1980. Gen X for short is the demographic cohort following the baby boomers and preceding the Millennials, which is the best cohort No, I just added that in there. But the millennials may be the best. What I'm hearing. I think the Lord said that. I just heard. Let's just move forward. So researchers in popular media use the mid to late 60s as the starting birth years and the late to 70s to early 1980s as the ending birth years. With this generation generally defined as people born from, again, 1965 to 1980. So, but by the definition of the U.S. Census data, there are about 65.2 million Generation Xers in the United States as of 2019. So you know it's a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. You never know. Most members of Generation X are children of the silent generation and early boomers. Xers are often the parents of millennials and Gen Zs. Now remember, we're going to get into Gen Zs because there's a big attack on Gen Zs. So I'm going to say this again. Xers are often the parents of millennials and Gen Zers, or Gen Zs. As children in the 1970s and the 1980s, a time of shifting societal values, Generation Xers were sometimes called the Latch Key Generation. An image spawning from children returning to an empty home and needing to use the door key due to reduced adult supervision compared to previous generations. This was a result of the increasing divorce rates and increasing maternal participation in the workforce prior to the widespread availability of child care options outside the home. So as adolescents and young adults in the 1980s and 1990s, Xers were dubbed the Mtv Generation, a reference to the music video channel, sometimes being characterized as slackers, cynical, and disaffected. Some of the many cultural influences of the Generation Xers youth included a proliferation of like musical genres with strong social tribal identities such as punk, post-punk, heavy metal. Pause, Jason, what you talk about punk? Stay in context. Now remember, these are multi-million-dollar industries. And I'm showing you how we're passing down depression and passing down all this junk, DNA, to each other. Listen to what people are going through outside your culture. Now, if this is your culture, just listen. Just, whatever. But whatever, I don't care what your culture is. Just listen, put your culture in there and be like, yeah, we was going through something similar. I promise you probably were. So, now look what grew out of the punk and post-punk and heavy metal. In addition to later forms developed by the Generation Xers themselves, they came up with grunge and grindcore and stuff like that. So I don't know what the grindcore was. I have heard of grunge. Shout out to the high school I went to. So film, remember, but we're in Generation X right now. Film both the birth of the franchise of mega sequels and the proliferation of independent films established in the part of videos was also notable cultural influences. So, and watch this. Video games, both in amusement parlors and the devices in the Western homes, were also a major part of the juvenile entertainment for the first time. Politically, many Eastern Bloc countries, Generation X experienced the last days. It's gonna make y'all feel old, but Generation X experienced the last days of communism and transitioned to capitalism as a part of its youth in the Eastern Blocs. I felt that. It was like, my God. I was on that Stairmaster and I felt younger until... Okay. Whilst in the midst of the Western world, a similar time period was defined by the dominance of the conservatism and the free market economics. In the midlife during the early 21st centuries, research describes them as active, happy, and achieving a work-life balance. Now, this cohort, Generation X, has also been credited as entrepreneurial and productive in the workplace more broadly. Generation Xers were privileged to experience the skyrocketing divorce rates of the 1960s and 70s that allowed moms to enter the workforce. And many Generation Xers became latchkey kids, like we talked about, with little to no adult supervision. So again, remember a lot of those child abductions and stuff like that happened during that time because many children carried their house keys around their neck, or remember, put them under the doormat. Nobody will look there. Remember, a lot of that crazy stuff happened during that generation. Put it under the doormat. Generation Xers experienced the increase of violent crimes in many communities. Not at all, but they experienced a lot of violent crimes, which means, again, the crimes that, a lot of those crimes were behind the closed doors, but a lot of the crimes that were in front of those doors, crack was introduced during this generation. The AIDS epidemic was also heavy during this time. This generation experienced a lot of diversity due to the increase of immigration of many cultures, and they were the first generation to grow up post integration too. So let's go deeper into that. So Generation Xers were able to survive better on their own because all of the years of not being able to or feel like they didn't have anybody to turn to but themselves. Not saying all, but again, through my research, a lot of Generation Xers are able to survive better on their own, again, because many years they had to. Many Generation Xers say Millennials. Now check this out. This is beef outside my culture, but this is funny. Many Generation Xers say Millennials and Generation Zs have their life stuck on technology, but it was actually Generation X that had the first computers and video games. But we all know the graphics were really great back then. No, they weren't. But again, many of them became the founders of modern Silicon Valley tech industry and led much of America's so-called economic recoveries in the 1990s. And I know they like hearing that. Many Generation Xers are stepping into top levels of leadership. And all I say is, will they abuse their power? Stay tuned. We got the Millennials, Generation Z, and then Generation Alpha next. And then we're done for part 1. Cohort number 6, the Millennials. Millennials, also known as Generation Y or Gen Y, are the demographic following the Generation X and preceding Generation Z. Most Millennials are the children of baby boomers and early Generation Xers. Millennials are often the parents of Generation Alpha. So Millennials are often the parents of Generation Alpha. That makes sense. Across the globe, young people have postponed marriage. Millennials born at the time of declining fertility rates around the world and are having fewer children than their predecessors. So how many of y'all are having more children than your parents? Some aren't. Some aren't. I think a lot aren't catching up with their parents or grandparents. Millennials have been described as the first global generation and the first generation that grew up in the internet age. And we have. But we still remember the pay phones. We still remember the pay. We remember the beepers. We still remember all of that. We still remember going to the library to find information. So I feel pretty powerful having the best of both worlds. Because doing those things don't feel weird to me because we've done those things versus, oh my God, Google's down. What are we going to do? So, we're the first generation that grew up in the internet age. So this generation is generally marked by elevated usage and familiarity with the internet, mobile devices, social media. Shout out to my MySpace and Black Planet account. It was looking good. Which is why they're sometimes we're termed digital natives. So we're digital natives. I don't even want to I was going to say something funny, but we're digital natives. Between the 1990s and 2010s, people from the developing world became increasingly well educated, a factor that boosted economic growth in these countries. Millennials across the world have suffered significant, I stand by this, millennials across the world have suffered significant economic disruption. Since starting their working lives, many faced high levels of youth unemployment during their early years in the labor markets in the wake of the Great Recession, and suffered another recession a decade later due to the 2020s pandemics. Another recession a decade later due to the 2020s pandemics. Many millennials and Gen Zs, according to, again, Life Outside My Culture, they said they are inheriting a system problems that we didn't cause. They said it's like being handed a bill for a party we didn't get to attend. I was like, man, that makes sense. I see what y'all going through. So according to Matthew Hennessy, author of 0 Hour for Gen X, How the Last Adult Generation Can Save the World from Millennials. I said, wow. He said this on the Washington Journal on C-SPAN. He joked and said, what if the baby boomers who currently own everything skips Generation X and passes down everything to the millennials? I say the world would change in about 72 hours for the best. Give us about 3 days. But I guess this scares a lot of people. But who they gonna pass it down to? Gen X, millennials, or Gen Z? Whoa. These are questions that keep you up at night. Now here we go. Last one for the millennials. Growing up with technology in high school, but remembering how to hunt for solutions versus thinking all my solutions are on Google. Remember this. Many solutions may be Google click or Bing click, but nature, the real world, will always have more answers than technology will ever have. That's just a fact. I don't care what you download, what apps y'all doing, nature always wins. Okay? Two more. Generation Z. This is the generation we got to focus on. Not saying all the rest, but remember, we're all arguing our generational perspective in real time, and we are just so confused why people are not thinking like my generational block. Generation Z, also known as Zoomers, a demographic cohort succeeding the millennials and preceding Generation Alpha. Researchers in popular media use the mid to late 1990s and starting birth years, and then the early 2010s as ending birth years. So again, like around 1997 to 2012. Most members of Generation Z are the children of Generation X. Now, as the first social generation to have grown up, check this out, the first social generation. Like, we socially doing this. To have grown up with access to the internet. If you look on the news, a lot of Gen Zs are going through a lot of stuff. Read that again. I will read it again. As the first social generation to have grown up with access to internet and portable digital technology, we can take this computer everywhere. Portable digital technology from a young age, members of Generation Z have been dubbed digital natives too, even though they are not necessarily digital literate. And see where they're going with this. Moreover, the negative effects of screen time are most pronounced on adolescents. Watch this, compared to younger children. I'll say that again. Moreover, the negative effects of screen time are most pronounced on adolescents compared to younger children. Compared to previous generations, members of Generation Z in some developed nations tend to be well behaved. They tend to live more slowly than their predecessors when they were their age. I don't even want to. They have lower rates of teenage pregnancies, which is good. They consume alcohol less, but not necessarily other psychoactive drugs. Generation Z teenagers are more concerned than older generations with academic performance and job prospects, and are better at delaying gratification than their counterparts from the 1960s, despite concerns to the contrary. And then this is what they said. I like that part because I do kind of compare that. Meanwhile, youth subcultures have been quieter through, they're not necessarily disappeared, but they have been a little bit more quiet. In addition, adolescents and youth adults in Generation Z have higher rates. Watch this. I'm going to say this slow. In addition, adolescents and youth, our young adults in Gen Z, have higher rates of allergies, higher awareness, and diagnosis of mental health problems, and are more likely to, watch this, watch what's helping it, and are more likely to be sleep deprived in many countries. Gen Z youth is more likely to have diagnosed intellectual disabilities and psychiatric disorders than older generations. Around the world, members of Gen Z are spending more time on electronic devices and less time reading books than before, with implications for their attention span, their vocabulary, and their school grades, as well as their future in modern economy is in jeopardy. In Asia, this is deep, check this out. In Asia, educators in the 2000s and the 2010s typically sought out and nourished their top students, whereas they said in the Western Europe and United States, the emphasis was on low performers. In addition, East Asian and students in Singapore consistently earned the top spots in the international standardized tests during the 2010s. So they said, we don't control. This is not my culture. Just have the ability. Eat the meat and spit out the bones. They just took a shot at us. They just said they focus on their top performers. They said y'all like to focus on y'all lower performers. I was like, that made me think. Last but not least, cohort number 8, Generation Alpha. These are 2013 to 2025. Now, Generation Alpha, or Gen Alpha for short, is the demographic cohort succeeding Generation Z. Researchers and popular media use the early 2010s as starting birth years and the mid 2020s as the ending birth years. So we got it at 2013 and 2025, give or take. Okay, named after the first letter in the Greek alphabet, Generation Alpha is the first to be born, watch this, entirely in the 21st century. Generation Alpha is the first to be born entirely in the 21st century. Most members of Generation Alpha are the children of Millennials. So again, most members of the Generation Alpha are the children of Millennials. So back then when you was like, well, we'll talk about that later. The birth period of Generation Alpha has seen failing fertility rates in much of the world. Childhood entertainment has been increasingly dominated by smart technology and streaming service, with the interest in traditional television concurrently reducing. That's television. Studies suggest that, watch this, let's look at Generation Alpha's possible issues. Studies suggest that allergies, obesity, and health problems related to screen time have been increasingly prevalent amongst children in recent years. That was a little game of, that's what y'all need to fight with Generation Alpha youth. Say it again. Allergies, obesity, health problems related to screen time, sitting. Your body is made to move. You're not made to sit unless you're meditating or sleeping or paying attention to something. Or driving, I'm just playing, have become increasingly prevalent among children in recent years. Now watch this. Man, thank God my babies ain't went through nothing. No, your babies get a little depression too. Your babies get a little recession too. One of the largest events in the short lives of Generation Alpha has been the COVID-19 pandemic. So remember, we went over the Spanish flu pandemic. We went over all these pandemics. Guess what they said? We gonna let y'all have a pandemic too. Y'all gonna have a pandemic too. Listen, y'all. The bad news about it is a lot of so-called older people are just living through more and just like, oh my God, another one. I know that probably makes y'all. But instead of doing that, go crazy helping the youth get out of this, whatever that is, whatever this is. Because depression does not have a color. Depression does not have a religion. Depression works like gravity. Like gravity works on rich people and poor people. Gravity don't let rich people float yet. We might find a way to pay gravity to let us float. I'm being sarcastic. So gravity works on rich people and poor people. Just like, okay. So again, one of the largest events in the short lives of Generation Alpha has been the pandemic, the current pandemic we're in, which isn't much of a direct threat to children, though, watch this, but does have many indirect impacts on their lives. Remember the quarantine, and watch this, and the mental health of the generations above them. Watch this, watching them cooking for them, raising them, transferring energies to them. Every generation is fighting for the current place, for their current place in this world at the same time. Every generation is fighting for their current place in this world. Yeah, everybody fight. Yeah. At the same time. It could be a smoother process. Now, here's some relationship and dating jabs I wanted to throw in for the Q&A. But this is fun, so I promise you, I wanted to just talk about this. Last one. Since many of us weren't alive to be accused of what we are being accused of, remember what the generation or the generations that are trying to give you advice, ask them, how did this advice work in your generation? And then what are the realities of that advice actually working in today's times? Because it sounds like all these generational blocks have problems, and they come from pandemics, and they come from all type of stuff that they need to focus on. So next week, because today we talked about a light introduction to the so-called Tower of Babel blocks of these different generations. Next week, we are going to decode the so-called Tower of Babel blocks of the lost generation, greatest generation, silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, Millennials, Generation Z, and Generation Alpha. Because guess what? There's infighting with Millennials, and there's fighting within Generation X, and there's fighting within baby boomers, and there's fighting within Gen Zs, and Generation Alphas will fight, but they ain't got no cars, and they can't meet up with other Generation Alphas to fight right now. So, to make a long story short, we are passing down the so-called depression that is literally going through all cultures, all races, all sexes, depression is literally like, I don't care what your religion is, I got you. I say, I'm going to keep saying it. If depression, low self-esteem, suicide was a person, we would have been marked it. We would have teamed up. Let's team up to finally put an end to this depression that's trying to put an end to us. So next week, and again, we're not going to go super deep, but next week is going to be a light decoding of our so-called Tower of Babel blocks within those 8 generations. Cool? Appreciate y'all time. We got it done. And I don't know how to turn this off.